Rob Clemens had spent years dedicating his life to justice. As the city's chief officer, he had faced corruption, crime, and discrimination head-on, always standing firm in his mission to protect and serve. But for the first time in years, he had allowed himself a break. A well-earned vacation in Mexico had been the perfect escape, sun, ocean waves, and, for once, a chance to breathe. That peace shattered the moment he stepped off the plane. His phone had been on airplane mode for the duration of his trip, and as soon as it connected to the local network, it buzzed with missed calls and urgent messages. He frowned, flipping through the notifications. "Rob, you need to come home. It's bad. Really bad. Call me the second you land." His stomach tightened as he rushed through customs and grabbed a taxi. The tension in his chest only grew as they neared his neighborhood, the familiar streets now lined with onlookers. Then, his heart nearly stopped. Where his house had once stood, his sanctuary, his home, there was now nothing but smoldering ashes and charred debris. The air was thick with smoke. Fire trucks were still on the scene, though the flames had long been extinguished. Neighbors stood in clusters, some murmuring among themselves, others avoiding his gaze altogether. He stepped out of the taxi, his breath caught in his throat. Shaking, he walked toward what little remained of his life. His hands clenched at his sides as he surveyed the destruction. Everything, his furniture, his photos, his memories, was gone. Years of hard work, reduced to rubble. A voice, quiet and hesitant, broke through his thoughts. "Rob. I need to tell you something." He turned, his eyes locking onto an elderly woman, Mrs. Carter, who had lived down the street for decades. She glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "Mary Timmons ordered it. She said, you don't belong here. She said she was tired of seeing you in her neighborhood." His blood ran cold. He had suspected discrimination in the community before, but nothing, had ever been this blatant, this hateful. Mary Timmons, the head of the HOA, had always been vocal about wanting to preserve the community's integrity, a thinly veiled code for keeping people like him out. Rob clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as rage bubbled beneath the surface. This wasn't an accident. This was an attack. A message. But they had made one fatal mistake. They thought he wouldn't fight back. Rob took a slow, steady breath, forcing himself to think past the anger and betrayal that burned through his veins. He had spent his entire career ensuring people like Mary Timmons couldn't get away with their corruption, their bigotry. She had clearly underestimated him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb landing on a number he never thought he'd need to call under these circumstances. His voice was sharp and controlled when the line connected. "Mr. Mayor, you need to come down here. Now." The mayor didn't hesitate. "Rob, what's going on?" "Arson," Rob said, eyes locked on the ruins of his home. "And I can tell you exactly who did it." By the time the mayor arrived, escorted by local officials and police, Rob had already gathered enough witness statements to paint a damning picture. He provided names, details, and a timeline. Every accusation pointed directly to Mary Timmons. Mary had been a problem for years. Twice before, she had been arrested for housing discrimination, and yet, through a combination of loopholes and political maneuvering, she had managed to keep her position as the HOA president. She had made it her mission to exclude people like Rob from the neighborhood, but no one had imagined she'd take it this far. When Mary finally arrived on the scene, flanked by members of the HOA board, her expression was smug, until she saw the mayor. Her face paled. "What's going on here?" she demanded, feigning ignorance. Rob stepped forward, his voice cold and measured. "You tell me, Mary. My house burned down while I was on vacation. Witnesses say you gave the order." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "That's ridiculous. Do you have any proof?" "Oh, I will," Rob assured her. "And when I do, you'll lose everything." For the first time, fear flickered across her face. The mayor, arms crossed, looked between them before nodding to the officers. "I want a full investigation. Interviews, security footage, financial records, everything." Mary stammered, her confidence crumbling. "Now wait just a minute. I had nothing to do with." "You've had free reign over this community for too long," the mayor interrupted. "If you're guilty, Mary, you'll pay for it. If you're innocent, the investigation will prove it. Either way, you don't control the narrative anymore." Rob met her gaze, unflinching. She had spent years trying to push him out. But now, he was the one standing firm. And he wasn't going anywhere. The mayor stood in silence, staring at the smoldering remains of Rob's home. The tension in the air was thick, an unspoken understanding settling over the crowd. Something was finally about to change. Rob turned to the officers. "I want her arrested." Mary's mouth fell open. "You can't." "I can," Rob interrupted, his voice steel. "You ordered my house to be burned down. You committed arson, a felony. You think you can weasel out of this like you have before?" The officers hesitated, looking to the mayor for confirmation. He gave a firm nod. "Take her in for questioning. We have more than enough witnesses." Panic flashed across Mary's face as the officers moved toward her. She took a step back, hands raised. "No. This is a mistake. My employees." "Your employees aren't the ones with a history of discrimination charges," Rob said. "That's all you, Mary." The officers placed her in handcuffs, and murmurs spread through the crowd. Some residents nodded in approval, others simply watched. Mary's power had kept them in fear for years, but not anymore. As she was led toward the police car, Rob felt a sense of justice beginning to take shape. But this was just the start. Mary's downfall sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. News of her arrest spread quickly, and soon, other residents came forward with stories of discrimination, of threats, of abuses of power that had gone unchecked for years. The investigation moved swiftly. Security footage from nearby homes confirmed what witnesses had already said. Mary had personally overseen the destruction of Rob's home, directing workers to demolish it before setting it ablaze. By the time she faced trial, the case was airtight. The HOA board, desperate to save face, publicly denounced her actions and vowed to reform its policies. But Rob wasn't stopping there. With the mayor's backing, he launched a full-scale crackdown on corrupt HOA practices citywide. No more unchecked power, no more discrimination hiding behind bylaws. Mary had wanted him gone. Instead, she had given him the power to change everything. Justice had finally come full circle. The news of the HOA's corruption and the fire spread quickly, drawing the attention of the media and local activists. Journalists dug deep into the HOA's past, uncovering years of discriminatory practices, financial fraud, and intimidation tactics. The community, once silent under Mary Timmons' rule, finally found its voice. People who had been afraid to speak out began sharing their own stories: unjust fines, baseless evictions, and threats aimed at those who didn't fit Mary's vision of the ideal neighborhood. As the investigation unfolded, city officials announced that the HOA would be disbanded. The power structure Mary had clung to for years crumbled before her eyes. She had ruled with fear, but now, fear had turned on her. Criminal charges loomed, and she could no longer hide behind her title. But while justice took its course, Rob still had to deal with the reality of losing his home. He had nowhere to go, no belongings, no sense of stability. The first few nights after the fire, he stayed at a hotel, trying to piece together his next steps. It wasn't until his neighbors came knocking on his door that he realized he wasn't alone. One by one, they stepped forward. Some offered financial help, others brought clothes and necessities. Many simply apologized. "We should have done something sooner," one man admitted, shaking his head. "We should have stood up to her. Rob was used to fighting battles alone. It had been his job, his duty. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of an entire community standing with him. Within weeks, efforts to rebuild began. Contractors and volunteers arrived to clear the debris. Fundraisers were held. The community came together in a way it never had before, all fueled by a shared purpose, to undo the damage Mary had caused and to make things right. The street, once divided, now buzzed with unity. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now worked side by side, painting, repairing, and rebuilding. For the first time, Rob saw what this neighborhood could be, not a place controlled by fear, but one built on solidarity. Months passed, and slowly but surely, Rob's house began to rise from the ashes. The foundation was laid, the walls went up, and before long, the home he had lost was taking shape once more. But this time, it wasn't just his house, it was a testament to the resilience of the people around him. Every nail, every brick, every coat of paint was a symbol of the change that had come to the neighborhood. People who had once turned a blind eye to injustice were now its loudest opponents. The HOA had been replaced with a fair and transparent committee, one that encouraged diversity rather than stifling it. Rob stood on the new porch, looking out at the people who had helped him get here. He saw Mrs. Carter, who had been the first to tell him the truth. He saw the mayor, who had ensured Mary faced the consequences of her actions. He saw the neighbors who had once been strangers but were now friends. The day of the housewarming, the entire neighborhood gathered to celebrate. Food was shared, music played, and for the first time in a long time, laughter filled the streets. Rob's heart swelled with gratitude as he took it all in. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Clemens, do you still miss your old house?" Rob knelt down to meet his eyes and smiled. "You know what? I don't think I do. Because this house, this home, isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us." Mary Timmons, now disgraced and facing legal repercussions, was nowhere to be seen. The house she had tried to erase stood tall, stronger than before. The neighborhood she had ruled through division now thrived in unity. And Rob, who had once been a target of her hatred, was now a symbol of resilience and justice. As the sun set over the newly rebuilt home, Rob took a deep breath. This wasn't just about a house. It was about proving that hate would never win. And in that moment, he knew, justice had, and always would, find a way.